Hey, what's up?
How you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
We would like to welcome all of our listeners to Moments with the Marcelins. My name is Jun.
And my name is Stephanie.
And on today's episode, we will continue the conversation from last episode on emotional and spiritual health.
Yeah, I'm excited for this part 2. We're going to dive in a little bit deeper just on two main areas that we found most effective in our lives that helped us transition into this emotional healthy awareness of, again, self and God. And so one of the first things that, again, we want to bring you on this journey that Jun and I have been on for the last couple of years. We really recommend the book Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzero. This book has literally shifted our souls when it came to finding a balance and rhythm, understanding our past, going through crisis and situations and really understanding again what God has to say about my emotional health, because I don't think it's talked about enough, and how that ultimately affects my physical well-being and, ultimately everything else that, portrays or kind of just oozes out of my life. So the first thing we want to dive into is
going back in order to go forward.
So good.
And you might hear that and you're like, wait a minute, go back. God says move forward. Yes, that is true. But sometimes in order to go forward, you need to look back to see where you currently are at. Just so you know, we need to look back to see where we came from. Mm-hmm. But it's important that we don't just stay there, but that we make progress. And part of this progress that we need to make in our lives is seeing the areas that we are not necessarily having victory in. Because, Steph, it is possible to be having so much success in one area of your life and completely failing in another area.
Right.
And so 2 things that he speaks on is that, the blessings and the sins of our families go back to 2 to 3 generations. Mm-hmm. And they profoundly impact who we are today. The second thing that he touches on is that discipleship requires, putting off these sinful patterns of our family of origin and, relearning how to do life God's way in God's family.
So there could be things that we say are quote unquote generational curses where we're not saying it's incorrect, but there also could be generational patterns or learned patterns that we saw growing up, because ultimately our family unit is one of the most powerful things that influenced us growing up.
Yes.
Our life was shaped by, experiences, circumstances, and everything like that. But the things that we saw in and out of those around us, and these are grandparents, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, parents, etc., they shaped a lot of what we see, a lot of what we do, and, ultimately some of the outcomes of our lives. And so, you have, young adults that are like, okay, well, I'm leaving home. I don't want to be like them anymore. I want to do me. And ultimately you see even in their life sometimes that these patterns ultimately continue because they, they were shaped by, these people that are fundamental in their lives, whether all of these individuals had a positive or negative effect, in you growing up.
What's so key about what you just said as far as what we saw? Because oftentimes we take on the good and both the bad from our family's upbringing. And so if you grew up in an environment where your parents, raise their voice all the time to make their point and yell, chances are
you do the same thing.
You're going to do the same thing. You have to make forth the effort to not be that way. But there's going to be times where you might resemble or, follow in that pattern. And so you might say, hey, I don't want to be anything like my father, but then find yourself doing that. And so it takes work and it takes effort in order to, break that cycle. And something that's also interesting is that your parents can say one thing, but do another. And what I've learned in my life is that more is caught than what is taught.
Yeah.
And so you can tell me not to do this, but if I see you doing that, chances are as your child, I'm going to do the same thing. And so the question is, do as I say or do as I do?
Right.
And I think the greatest example is to do what I do, to model that. But for many of us, our parents stated one thing, but they did another, which left us confused. I know I was confused in moments in my life.
Like when someone would call your mom's phone and she would ask you to pick up the phone and to tell them that she wasn't there, but she was literally right next to you. You're like, oh, so I can lie myself out of situations. Bet. Like, you know what I mean? You learn these things. And again, they're quote unquote white lies or whatever, whatever you want to use to excuse that behavior. Ultimately, these are things that are taught and that subconsciously become part of what we do in and out. So when you're caught with something, you automatically want to stay a lie instead of telling the truth. Right. You know what I mean? When you're confronted, you automatically want to excuse that behavior because that's what you saw growing up.
So good.
And it's, it just becomes part of who you are. And you want to break it, but you don't understand that it was a pattern that was developed. Like literally patterns in your brain were developed for that type of behavior. And therefore, then you hear about, is it nature or nurture? You know what I mean? Like, were you born this way or, because again, we're born into sin. So can iniquity. Sin be transmitted through your DNA? Like, to be honest, like that's a question, right? So if we're born in sin, then, does it transmit through our DNA? And then ultimately, does nurture have an effect on that, which is our environment growing up, which I honestly believe it's both.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think it is a combination of both. Again, going back to Adam and Eve, our original parents, because of their sin, we now live in a fallen nature. Right. Now we have to experience what pain is and death and betrayal and lying and all these things and deceit. And so, that's the nurture. The nurture or the nature, the nature part of it, and then the nurture is, like you said, what we grew up in.
You have the story of Jacob in the Bible. Jacob's name literally means liar. Jacob's father was Isaac. Isaac's father was Abraham. What did they all have in common that they all did at one point in their life? Lie. So you see that he was born into as a deceiver. So it could have been DNA, but it could also have been nurture because he saw that deceit growing up. So you know what I mean? Either way, I think we are made up of what we're born into, like DNA, and then what we are, our environment. But obviously our environment does have a huge role to play in our patterns and behavior and ultimately generational consequences as well.
And the beautiful thing about all of this, whether it's nurture, whether it's nature, or a combination of both, which is what we both believe, we can break it.
That's right.
We can break it.
Absolutely.
And we have the authority to break it. And it's important that we understand that we have the power to break these cycles and to change that. And we don't have to live out what our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents did, because we have this authority and we have Jesus within us, and so we can do what we call repentance, which is a complete 180, which means a U-turn, to turn around. You were walking one way, now you decide to walk another way.
That's right.
And so we have that ability to break that with God's help and also with counseling.
And so one of the things that we did during this journey of ourselves is because, of course, you can pray about certain things, but that may not be the do all be all for that situation. There may be some work that we have to do because, again, faith without works is dead. So there is some work that I have to do internally in my soul for me to be aware of some of these generational consequences that we've all walked into in our life. And one of those things that we did through this journey is a genogram. And so if this is the first time you're ever hearing of a genogram, let us break that down for you. A genogram is a look into your past. And these are passed through family members, circumstances, the highlights of their lives, the low points of their lives, and what adjectives resonate with their history. And what I mean by that is that, for example, when I did my genogram, I found that there was adjectives that literally my parents and my grandparents all identified as part of their own life.
Wow.
So the ways that I would describe circumstances in my life is the exact same way that they would describe circumstances in their life, which was a huge eye opener for me, because I'm like, wow, we both experienced the same thing during our journey in our life. So for example, growing up, there was a moment in my life where I felt very alone and very lonely, to the point where I felt abandoned. And when I did this genogram and I went back to my parents and I asked them about, certain pivotal moments in their life that they felt, really altered, their journey, huge traumatic experiences in their life. Both of my parents said, during this season of my life, in my childhood years, I felt lonely and abandoned. And so for me to hear from my parents the same thing that I had seen in my own life, I was like, wow, that is a generational consequence. If I don't do things in my life today for my future children, there may be a moment in their life where they may feel lonely and ultimately abandoned.
Yeah.
So I was like, what do I need to change in my day today right now, so that way I, prevent them from that? Because again, these are patterns that have been developed, generational consequences that, kind of, arose. And so now that I'm aware of that, I can do something with it.
Yeah, that's so good. I think for me, in my family, at least particularly on my father's side, there was a lot of anger there, and I saw that my father dealt with it. And, in the few conversations that I had with him about it, because my father was someone who kind of didn't share his emotions that way. He would carry it on his face, but he didn't share. There's so much that is just unknown, and I lost him at an early age, just 20 years old. And so many questions that I have now as a 31-year-old man, I don't get the ability to get to know what that is, And one thing that I would say that I feel like is a similarity with my father and maybe his father, in the aspect of, sometimes anger, is also not necessarily sharing your emotions. Like, and what I mean by that is I share my emotions, but like there's a level that I will allow someone to know.
Yeah.
And it's like, if I feel like you're getting too close, I kind of keep you afar off. And we were literally having this conversation, before we started recording. And I'm just like realizing that I'm like, I kind of keep people at bay, and that's an area in my life that I would like to really work on, And I noticed it with my father as well, that he would kind of keep me at bay, because I'd be like, Dad, what's going on? Tell me how you feeling. Like, why are you crying? Why are you so upset? Why are you, why are you quiet? And, he just kind of brush it off. And I feel like I'm doing a little bit better than what he did, but I'm not where, you
want to be.
Where I would want to be.
Yeah.
And it's important to know that obviously whoever it is that I have this conversation with is someone that can be trusted, because you don't just want to open up to just anyone. It's important to have authenticity at all times, but you don't have to be as transparent with everyone.
Say that.
There's a level of degree of transparency that you have with people. What I share with you, I'm not going to share with, my homeboy,
That's right.
And so it's important. It's important that, we're wise in who we share and what we share.
Right. Absolutely. So we encourage you to do a genogram for your family. Do it, for yourself. Go back 1, 2, and if you can, 3 generations to really see, what are these patterns that I have adapted to and adopted in my own life that I want to change? And therefore you become aware of them as well.
We often underestimate the deep unconscious imprint that our family of origin leave on us. The older I get, the more I realize the influence and the impact that my family's values have on my life.
That's right. And so there's main things in our lives and in our journeys that, again, we kind of adapt as patterns that could be good or bad. Not all of these things that we live through have to be horrible, traumatic, earthquakes, in our life. So the first one, when you're doing this genogram to kind of think about is, how did my family handle money? Were they savers? Were they spenders? Was there always retail therapy because there was always something going on? The second one is conflict. How did they resolve conflict? Were they able to sit down and talk about, what happened and what they felt? Or was it loud and angry and door slamming and things like that? The other one to think about is sex. Was sex spoken about? Was it healthy or unhealthy? How is that mirrored when it came to male and female roles? Could males be promiscuous and women have to be calm and collected and only speak when spoken to? What did that look like? How did your family navigate through grief and loss?
Yeah, was sadness seen as a sign of weakness? Or, were you told, get over it and move on? Another thing is, how did your family express anger? Was anger seen as being dangerous and bad? For me, sometimes growing up is don't be angry. And that's a sin. And it's like, no, it's not. The scripture that says be angry and do not sin.
Right.
What were your family's view on, what was the family dynamic and view? I know for some cultures, you owe all your you owe your parents for all that they have done for you. You don't speak about what happens in home. You keep whatever happens at the house stays at the house.
That's right.
You don't go to counseling. You don't do any of these things.
Culture of secrecy.
The culture of secrecy. And I can personally attest that was one of those unspoken commandments in my household.
How did your family model relationships with other individuals that were not quote unquote blood? Were you told that you can't trust people because people are always going to let you down, have no expectations for individuals around you, or that, if you trust people, they're going to want something in return, or were you modeled a healthy way to have friendships and relationships? How did your family and what was their attitude on different cultures or ethnicities? Were you told that you can only be friends with people like you can only date within your quote unquote ethnicity or your race, because we only have one race, it's a human race. So, what was that like? What was those attitudes against or with certain cultures, or was it positive? Did you grow up in a multicultural environment and therefore you saw everyone the same?
The next thing is, what defined success in your family?
That's right.
Is it getting into the best schools?
Was it marrying someone that was wealthy? Yeah. Was it making lots of money and working yourself to the ground, and therefore you have a complete imbalance or no rhythm of work-life balance? Was it that you had to get married and have children to be successful, or was it just you're in the will of God and therefore you're successful? You know what I mean? So depending on, what you saw growing up, that'll determine, what is success, and therefore what patterns you have in your life when it comes to success.
Also, feelings and emotion. What did that look like in your family dynamic? Were you told that you were not allowed to have certain feelings? Or was that like an unspoken commandment?
Yeah. Were you told that, you should not, think about how you feel, how you feel is invalid or unimportant? Or were you told that, you can express yourself in an emotional, healthy way? You can tell your parents, hey, I am mad. Or were you told again that you can't feel those type of things because, it's bad? So that's one aspect of, emotional health, emotional and spiritual health that I think will help you, on this journey. The second thing that we wanted to also touch on is having rhythms in our lives based on rest and based on silence and solitude. And so this has been for me one of the things that I think has resonated and changed the pulse of my soul. And I say pulse because I am someone who has dealt with anxiety for a long, long time. And I even think going back to my preteen years, and I would honestly feel that my physical pulse was just skyrocketed. But sometimes our soul also has a pulse that we don't think about and we do not resonate with. And one of those things that helped me is rest And I know that this word is so foreign to our generation because we live in a cycle of busyness. Mm-hmm. And busyness will steal your rest. Busyness doesn't make you productive. Just because something grows fast doesn't mean that it's healthy. And you can be sitting there listening to this and you are working yourself to the ground, whether that's in ministry, whether that's in, your secular vocation, nonprofit sector, whatever you do, you're working yourself to the ground and you do not have rest. And therefore, if you physically don't have rest, emotionally, you don't have rest either.
So good.
And this is one of the realizations that I think hit me the hardest because for so long, I did not have a rhythm of rest. And note that we say rhythm, we don't say balance. Jun and I don't believe that you will have a balance in life, but rather you find your rhythm in life. There is a rhythm. There is a tempo to your life that you need to find. There's going to be things that you're going to pick up in one season and then drop them in the next one. And so
it looks different every season.
Absolutely. It's not going to look the same.
Yeah.
And so just because you could balance 3 or 4 things in your singlehood,
doesn't
mean you're going to balance 3 or 4 things when you get married.
Or when you have a child.
Or when you get into a committed relationship, or when you start school or a semester. It's going to look different every single time. But within that rhythm, there has to be rest. And rest and the Sabbath, which is what the Bible talks about, has to do more with surrender than you can actually think. Sabbath is, you literally chilling, like, you know what I mean? Taking days to relax, enjoy life, do things that you love, do things that you enjoy, rest your mind, rest your body, whatever. But the spiritual component in that is me telling myself that even if I'm not working, God is still in control. Even if I don't lift a finger, God is still God. So I may even dare to say that if you don't rest, you struggle with pride because you feel like you can do it all. Mm-hmm. And that's the conviction that I faced probably 2 years ago when I finally started understanding how important was it for me to have rest and how much more effective I was as a person, as a wife, as a manager, as a pastor, as whatever you want to call it, how much more effective I'm going to be because I am working out of that rest rather than always at 100. Mm-hmm. Individuals that say, oh, I'm going to sleep when I'm dead, always grinding, team no sleep. Right. That is unhealthy. There is no balance. There is no rhythm to their life. And again, that goes back to, what did you learn to be success?
Right.
Is success just being in the will of God? Or is success you having a certain number in your bank account? You know what I mean? Like, what is that? And so for me, and I know that that's one of the things that our generation, I feel like steals it, that is stealing so much from our generation, is the aspect of rest. And we're losing our generation younger because of stress.
That's so good. And when we talk about work and Sabbath, it's important that we have rest and that we do have a Sabbath because it's a celebration of time rather than of space. And for example, we have 2 individuals. We have an individual who may struggle with pornography, and then you have another individual that struggles with rest. They want to constantly work to be successful. Both individuals are dealing with a void that they're trying to fulfill to be accepted. Why is one celebrated and the other shamed? Because when you look at the root of it,
that's right.
It's the same thing. There's a void there. Who told you that you needed to work and not ever rest?
Right.
Because when you look at the Bible, when you look at scripture, it's a commandment to rest.
That's right.
But it is the most probably ignored commandment out there.
Yeah.
And God himself rested because he wanted to model and label out that blueprint. And so when we don't do that, we're doing a disservice not only to the Father, but we're doing a disservice to ourselves. And when we rest, we're resting the whole person, our physical, our spiritual, emotional, and mental self.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important that when you take a Sabbath, that if you work with your hands, you should Sabbath with your mind. And if you work with your mind, you should Sabbath with your hands. It's a quote. I forget who says that.
That's so good.
But that is so true.
Mm-hmm.
We need to find rest.
Absolutely. And so within this moment of rest, it doesn't just have to be just one day. These are things that you can incorporate like on your every single day. And you can do like these moments of rest, throughout, 2, 3, 4 times a day, like where you again rest your mind, rest your hands. And again, when it comes to rest, is, it's also coming back to God. Like you want to bring this back to, hey, he's the source, he's the one, and whatnot. And during that time, in addition to Sabbath, I think it's also important to find silence. Mm. I don't know about you, June, but I'm going to speak for myself. The season that we are in politically in our society has been overwhelmingly emotionally draining, where my soul has felt uneasy for a while, and my soul is constantly talking. My mind is constantly racing because of fears, because of, uncertainties, and all these different things. And there has to be a moment that we silence it all. Mm-hmm. Not just externally, because you can turn off the TV, you can turn off your phone, put your phone on D&D, turn off YouTube, whatever, but your soul is still loud. Mm-hmm. So there has to be moments where you quiet your soul as well. And God doesn't just speak to you in the thunder. He also speaks to you in the whisper.
That's good.
So what moment am I allowing God to whisper to my soul? How many oftentimes do we miss him because everything around us and internally is loud? And so that's been a reflection in my personal life to silence my soul, because you can go to the park and it's quieter, around you, but again, your soul is full of noise. Yeah. So what are you doing to silence that?
And the only way you're going to be able to hear that whisper is your level of proximity. Mm. Your level of proximity will determine whether or not you're able to hear that whisper. Because if I'm with you and we're in an environment that's loud, if I'm 15, 20 feet away from you and you're trying to whisper something to me, I'm not going to be able to hear you. Yeah. But if I'm close to you, even with the noise that is going on around me, I'm able to focus in and hear you more clearly. And it's the same in our relationship with the Father, that our level of proximity will be able to determine how clear we're able to hear him. We're hearing all these different things. We're hearing all these politicians. We're hearing all these different things. But are we hearing the Father?
Yeah. And so in these moments of silence, of rest, of coming back to, the Father, having that moment of people say, having that devotion with him, so many oftentimes maybe we were taught that in your devotion, you're going to get something from God. You're going to get a word or direction, whatever. But sometimes your devotion, or in that time of stillness, of quietness, is not really just to get something from him. It's just to be with him.
So good.
It's to just be with him, It's just to be, not do, just be. So my question to you is, when was the last time you stopped doing and you were just being with God? When was that last time that your soul was quiet? And we're uncomfortable with just 15 seconds of silence, June. It doesn't take much. But I challenge you, after listening to this, turn off the podcast, put your phone on D&D, and sit in silence. And silence your soul, silence your mind, silence the noise around you so you can hear his whisper, because I promise you he's saying something.
Wow, that's such a great discussion. Let's get into a question that we have from one of our listeners.
So the question we received is, My in-laws give me and my husband unsolicited advice frequently, and they get upset when we don't take it. How can I create a healthy boundary?
That's a great question.
It is a great question. There are some family dynamics that are a bit challenging. There could be traditions, cultures that, that bring forth expectations into your marriage and into your relationship. I think the question was great because it talked about first boundary. That is definitely something that I would advise that you guys talk about, and the boundary should come from the son or the daughter of that particular in-law. So that way it's basically the child speaking to the parent. We're not going to say that they're bad people. We're not going to say that they're ill-intentioned, because ultimately, no one wants to come from a bad place and give you advice. People do it because they care. But sometimes when it comes to parenting, what I've understood is that there is a tough transition from being an authority to be an advisor when solicited. And so therefore there is that tough transition, especially when, you're newlyweds or you haven't been married that long or whatever. And so, they just want you to succeed. So first case scenario, think the best. They're not doing it ill-intentioned. But the boundaries should be set and be clear on those expectations and those boundaries. Hey, when it comes to this, I appreciate it, but it's not necessary, at this moment. And again, let it come from the son or the daughter of that particular parent. Secondly, when you do set those expectations and those boundaries, always remember that it doesn't matter the age. Individuals may not be mature enough to receive that back. It may be tough. They may not like it. They may tell you that they don't like it and they don't agree, but that ultimately is on them, and you're not responsible for someone's emotional
maturity.
If they can't take it, knowing that they're, that you're expressing, hey, I appreciate it. I, love it. I value it, but therefore I don't need it. And therefore setting that boundary. In the Bible, it talks about, when you become married, the two shall become one, and you will leave your father and your mother. So you will create a culture of your own separate from your parents. And so I think expressing that as well is like, this is the culture that we want to build. This is the environment we want to have. And therefore, we appreciate it. But again, it's not necessary. In the Bible, there is a pretty funny story in the book of Samuel. I think it's 1 Samuel, where Saul is obviously David's father-in-law. And we all know that he was not the best father-in-law. You know what I mean? He was out to get David numerous times. In chapter 19, Michal actually saves David's life from her father. And so what happens is that Saul sends a whole, armies and troops over to David's house. And then they were told to ultimately kill David. So they had a plot to harm him. And Michal stood by David's side and was like, hey, no, you're not going to harm him. You're going to escape tonight, because if not, you're going to, literally die. So she threw him, they plotted, had an escape plan to have him out the window. But what that shows me is that even if the in-laws have a plan against or for your marriage, ultimately you married your spouse, and so you guys are literally on the same team, and therefore work together on those issues from that team standpoint. And so she stood by him. She stood by David, even against her father as well.
And hopefully no one's trying to take your spouse's life. But
definitely not.
I hope that helps. I want to thank you all for listening to today's episode. I want to encourage you to make sure that you subscribe, that you share with a friend, and let us know what other questions that you may have, and we can answer it here on this podcast.
Absolutely. You can DM us or email us at info@mmoments.co. Thank you for tuning in. We hope that this enriched your life.
Take care. God bless, and much love.
Much love.